Have you ever wondered why, endlessly overanalyzing our past sometimes just makes us feel worse instead of better? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating approach to how our minds actually organize our most painful experiences. We're going to explore a framework that literally shifts the focus entirely away from just analyzing our trauma and instead uses imagination, distance, and, get this, the metaphor of cooking to actually help us heal. So I want to pose a question directly to you. How do you hold your most painful memories? In our modern culture, we are all exceptionally good at narrating our issues, right? We read about psychology, we constantly diagnose ourselves, we endlessly spin our stories. But what if the actual problem isn't the painful story itself, but how our psychological system compulsively organizes around it? To really get a grip on this, we're going to look at the deeply moving story of a 23-year-old graduate student. Okay, so picture this young Chinese graduate student. She grew up in a household that was heavily controlled by a really volatile, punishing grandmother. And the one true source of warmth in her life, her grandfather, passed away when she was just 6 years old. To survive the emotional coldness and the threats that followed, she did what so many kids do. She numbed out. She literally just switched off her feeling register so she could concentrate, achieve, and, well, endure. And honestly, it worked. Until it didn't. Eventually, she realized she was coming across as super cold and completely unable to empathize with her own friends. She desperately wanted to change that, but she had absolutely no idea where to even begin. Okay, let's dive into this. What happened next was an actual, anonymized therapeutic encounter, and it took place entirely over the messaging app WeChat. When this student reached out, the therapist didn't start with some formal, rigid clinical intake form, and they definitely didn't ask her to just start recounting her childhood trauma right off the bat. Because doing that would have just invited the student to use her already super well-developed analytical defenses. Instead, the therapist offered this simple, completely unexpected creative task. The therapist offered this incredible prompt. They said, imagine the events in your life are ingredients in your kitchen. Make a dish out of them. Don't judge or overthink. Work with what you have. I mean, this intervention is just brilliant. By asking her to play with a metaphor rather than intellectually analyze a memory, the therapist completely bypassed the student's analytical guard posts. There was zero pressure to be psychologically fluent, just a totally open invitation to explore. And the student's response? Phenomenally vivid. She organically categorized her memories right into these specific ingredients. Those first 6 years of her life with her grandfather, she described that as honey or ripe fruit, warm, golden, and good. But then came the bitter herbs, the vinegar, and a broken jar of salt spilling everywhere. That represented her grandmother's threats in the sheer coldness of the house. And then, most heartbreakingly, she described a hollow powder, an ingredient that looks substantial but literally crumbles the second you touch it. That represented the neglect, the feeling of being totally forgotten and crying alone in empty rooms. For years, she'd been trying to just throw all those bitter ingredients away, but intuitively, she realized that's just not how a kitchen works. She wrote back with this beautiful realization. She said, I'd make a very simple congee. The bitterness doesn't disappear, but it gets absorbed into something warm and manageable. There is just profound wisdom in this completely unprompted metaphor. She realized that real healing isn't about emotionally sterilizing your past or magically erasing the pain. It's actually about transforming how you hold and relate to that experience. So why exactly did this kitchen metaphor work so beautifully to break through her numbness? Let's zoom out for a quick second and look at the actual clinical psychology framework driving this whole encounter, because it is all about understanding how we organize our psychological experience. This approach is called mindfulness-based experiential therapy, or MBT for short. MBT is a process observational clinical framework. It doesn't primarily try to manage your symptoms or correct your thoughts. Instead, it really focuses on how your experience is organized. It's this massive, crucial pivot from asking, okay, what is your painful story, to asking, how is your psychological system compulsively organizing around it? The therapist observes how you hold the memory, how you defend against it, and how you naturally pace yourself. Now, today, so many of us possess this vast psychological vocabulary, right? We're highly skilled at chronically analyzing, categorizing, and diagnosing ourselves. MBET actually calls this performative self-awareness. And our culture totally rewards this kind of explanation over actual observation. But here's the trap. We can perfectly narrate our trauma to a therapist or our friends, yet remain highly unstable, fragmented, and constantly dependent on reassurance. We kind of confuse intellectual sophistication with actual psychological stability. And this brilliantly illustrates the core aim of MBET, observational restructuring. This isn't about erasing painful thoughts or forcing some big dramatic catharsis. It's really about gradual changes in your relationship to the experience itself. By using symbolic mediation, like that kitchen metaphor, the therapist helped the student hold her grief with way less urgency and a lot more psychological flexibility. Direct analytical confrontation often just makes us more defensive, But a metaphor allows the psyche to reorganize itself gently. Within this framework, the therapist acts in a very specific way. They aren't acting as some corrective authority figure. They're not trying to force you into a rapid breakthrough. Instead, they track your organizational process. They act as distance mediators and pacing stabilizers. Really, their primary job is simply to protect the unfolding psychological process so it can reorganize organically without being rushed toward premature closure. Which brings us to one of the absolute most clinically useful distinctions in the entire MBT framework. It perfectly explains why being highly articulate about your trauma absolutely does not mean you're actually stable. So let's shift our focus to the crucial difference between stability and collapse. Okay, so observational stability means you have the capacity for sustained contact with your experience. You have reduced urgency, totally flexible attention, and a real willingness to just remain uncertain. Observational collapse, on the other hand, is when your system gets completely overwhelmed. This looks like emotional engulfment, extreme panic, rigid certainty, or, and this is super common, collapsing into defensive, abstract intellectualization. Someone might sound incredibly smart and analytical, but observationally, they are in total collapse. It's really crucial to remember that stability does not equal emotional comfort. You might be experiencing deep grief, shame, fear, or vulnerability, but if you are observationally stable, you remain in actual contact with those difficult feelings without excessively fusing with them or fragmenting. The ultimate goal is transformation in how you relate to the experience, not just trying to numb the pain away. Let's zoom back into our young student story to see how these exact concepts were practically applied to her specific struggle with emotional numbing. Because honestly, it all comes down to finding the right psychological distance. When the student reflected on how incredibly painful it was to look back at those early childhood memories, she had this massive realization. She said, "To avoid pain, I'm trying to ignore my emotions." This is a classic textbook survival defense against the bitter herbs of her past. A child who learns that feelings are dangerous naturally learns to stand as far away from them as possible. They stay safe, rational, and entirely alone. Now, what's really interesting here is the therapist's response to that numbing. Instead of pushing her to just dive headfirst into the pain, they introduced another really powerful visual metaphor: the magnet and the nail. They told her, if you get too close, you are stuck to the magnet. If too far, you feel nothing. Stay far enough facing to feel something. This magnet metaphor is all about regulating psychological distance. The work isn't to rush blindly toward the magnet. It's to find that precise, perfect distance where feeling actually becomes possible without turning into an overwhelming emotional engulfment. The therapist advised her to approach this difficulty only when she was feeling strong and prepared. For someone who grew up with absolutely zero control over when trauma hit, choosing exactly when to approach difficulty is in itself a really profound form of healing. You literally can't rush it. You have to allow it to cook on low heat. Which really brings the narrative full circle to the student's beautiful realization. The dish is still cooking. And this wasn't just some poetic sign-off. It perfectly demonstrated a major organizational shift in her psyche. She replaced that desperate urgency for premature closure with a calm, process-oriented flexibility. She finally recognized that healing is ongoing, and she was totally willing to remain in contact with her experience. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative final thought. How are you organizing your own painful experiences, and exactly what distance are you keeping from the magnet? Take a little time to reflect on your own kitchen of memories. Are you frantically trying to throw those bitter ingredients away, or are you actually finding the right distance to let them absorb into something warm and manageable? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this truly transformative framework.